Now to gain even more perspective on today's deadly terror attacks, earlier I spoke with two veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, author and former Marine Elliot Ackerman, who served 5 tours of duty, and Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger, who is still an Air Force reservist. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
You bet.
Thank you.
Representative Kinzinger, let me start with you. 13 U.S. troops were killed today, the most in a single day in a decade. Was this avoidable?
Look, in Congress, we got a brief on this a couple days ago with actually the most crystal clear evidence I've ever heard in terms of what's coming through intel. And so the real question is, how did these bombers slip through the Taliban lines? And I think that's the question. We're relying on the Taliban to secure that perimeter. We'll find out if it was avoidable, but it's certainly tragic.
And Mr. Ackerman, ISIS-K is claiming responsibility for this bombing. Tell us about the power vacuum that's created when the Afghan government fell so swiftly. And do you fear that the region will become even more of a breeding ground for extremism?
I absolutely have that fear, and I think it's something that we've seen occur time and again. We saw it occur in Iraq after our rapid withdrawal in 2011, which led to the rise of the Islamic State 3 years later in 2014. And we're seeing it occur right now in real time in Afghanistan when ISIS-K has now announced itself. So if there's any sense that the Taliban can keep al-Qaeda from arriving in Afghanistan, that should be totally dispelled by today's events. They're there and they've announced themselves.
And Congressman, President Biden said today that these terrorists will not win, that he's going to hunt them down and make you pay. And yet many of the critics of this withdrawal described it as a failure of intelligence. How reliable is our counterterrorism effort at this point?
I don't think it's very reliable. I mean, it doesn't mean we're not going to try to find targets. We may find some ISIS-K targets to kill, maybe even the leaders of this attack if we're lucky. But keep in mind, every kind of counter-terrorist operation has to have people on the ground. We look at our success against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. We had people on the ground embedded with local forces. It's hard to imagine that without having people on the ground, we're going to be able to successfully attack and put a serious dent, if not dismantle, ISIS-K. We'll get some payback, that's fine. But I think that the visual of America leaving, and America leaving it after taking, in fact, casualties, 13 dead at this point, it's certainly going to be a boon to jihadist recruitment. That's what I worry about as well.
Mr. Ackerman, you've been working with a network of former military people for nearly 2 weeks now to try to get people out of Afghanistan. Tell me about some of those desperate messages that you've been absolutely inundated with, and what does that say about the U.S. military's plan or lack thereof to evacuate?
I don't think you can pin any of this on the U.S. military. The U.S. military and the Marines at Kabul airport have behaved nothing short of heroically the last 2 weeks. The final group that I was able to help coordinate into the airport of Afghan refugees and also some American citizens was 29, and we got them through Abbey Gate 20 minutes before that blast occurred today. What we're seeing is a massive policy failure, a massive failure to execute on the part of President Biden and his administration. There were members of Congress in very strong voices warning about just such a series of events as we're seeing occurring as far back as April, and the administration refused to heed those warnings.
You've worked in policy in D.C. at the White House. What policy failure do you point to, and what could have been done better?
Many people in the media have compared this to Saigon. It's worse than Saigon. You need to only look at a map to see that in Vietnam, when we were evacuating that country, you had hundreds of miles of coastline that you had. Afghanistan is a landlocked country, so it doesn't take an expert in grand strategy to realize that if you're trying to get everyone out of a single airport, it's going to be a total disaster. We should have left our airports, places like Bagram Airfield, Kandahar Airfield, open. Right now, we're trying to get everybody out of a single access point, and it's a corner that we backed ourselves into and we backed our military into.
Adam, you were a former Air Force pilot. You flew tours over Afghanistan and Iraq. Do you think that responsibility lays at the foot of President Biden and his policy planners?
I think, frankly, both parties failed the American people in this. I think President Trump negotiated an awful deal. He was talking about how unimportant Afghanistan was while he was negotiating that deal, and they didn't enforce the deal during that time. Well, then President Biden comes in. He's reversed a number of President Trump's stuff, including Nord Stream 2 sanctions on the Russian pipeline. He owns the tactics of this. So he made the decision to withdraw. We vacated Bagram. We basically were in a position where we saw that everything was collapsing, and instead of at least defending Kabul for the moment while we got everybody out, we end up having to rely on Taliban to protect, our sworn enemy, to protect us at the airfield. So both presidents bear blame for this, but certainly at this moment, this is on Joe Biden and nobody else.
Gentlemen, thank you both for your insights, both for your service and for joining us today.
You bet.